Welcome, students and teachers, to our third summer-fall season of the Constitution in American Life with us, the Friends of Publius, or known as FOPs in other parts of the world. Since many of you are new to the program, let us just take a minute to introduce the band to you. We have Professor Tim Moore from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was a former We the People teacher, has been involved in the We the People program since, I don't know, over 30 years, I would imagine. He's a little under the weather, so hopefully you'll give him thumbs up for his commitment to civic education here. And you'll notice in his voice, I just want you to know he doesn't drink whiskey or chain smoke. That's a voice due to illness there. We also have with us Professor Chris Kavanaugh, a longtime We the People coach, mentor, teacher, one of the finest high school civic educators in the United States of America. He taught for many years south of Indianapolis, and he currently resides in the great state of North Dakota. I got to watch the North Dakota Little League team there, Chris, compete, and that was impressive in that sense. And lastly, we have Dr. Mike Williams from the University of San Diego, professor of political science, international relations. He's also a pseudo administrator. I think he teaches one class a term there. He is involved in change makers at the USD campus. And he is an alum kind of the We the People program, having been part of the pilot class in the class of 1987, way back in the day before social media technology of any kind that we have today. And myself, I'm the moderator, David Richmond, a longtime We the People teacher and just a supporter of the We the People program. I thought, I know tonight we're going to be talking predominantly to Unit 1 and to teachers, and so hopefully you can kind of share some of this information. But we just want to remind you of what the mission of the Constitution of American Life is. We'd like to appeal to a broad audience as possible. We believe that we talk about subjects that every American citizen should know about, yet this program is designed specifically to address questions presented to students throughout the country in the We the People, the Citizen, and the Constitution program, the largest and, in my humble opinion, the bestest civic education program out there in this country of ours. So it's our goal to address what are currently the 2023-24 state level questions that students will have to deal with. It is not our goal to give direct specific answers to each part of the question. We hope to have a discussion ourselves that hopefully provides some direction. Sometimes there's no way for us not to give maybe some explicit answers to some things, but that is not our goal. It's to get, hopefully, students and teachers to help them think about the questions and look at them from possibly a myriad of angles that they haven't thought about there. And so that's kind of our mission here, and we hope that we are able to achieve that when all is said and done in the spring of 2024. Since we last saw students in April of 2023, we have seen two, I think, very important trends, circumstances arise. First and foremost, the Dodgers are leading the National League West, and the Brewers are leading the National League Central there. And I will admit, because I am I guess I have a monopoly on being wrong, because I did say when we last saw each other that we would see the end of the Dodger dynasty, but I was thrown a curveball by that great organization, and they are currently 11 games in front of the second place Arizona Diamondbacks in the National League West. And then we have the San Francisco Giants and the Chicago Cubs. They are battling for a wild card spot as we go into the last month of the season. So you'll be hearing a little bit about that from the four of us, because we can go transition very quickly from the Constitution to Major League Baseball and sound as equally as intelligent. I don't know what that means. I don't know if we want to go there, but
I don't know if it's true.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I think it's sadly very true, because
so the second thing that, since we last saw students and teachers in April, is what I would consider a continuation of the Supreme Court of the United States. I guess, I don't know, a trend to fundamentally change important doctrines and understandings of the Constitution. I look back to when we first started this program, and there has been a lot of change. Hopefully we'll be able to talk sometime throughout the season about this, but just some things to point out. The importance of precedents and standing, all right? Limits on the power of the judicial branch, in my humble opinion, could possibly be dead. As again, I hope we were able to touch on the hardening of the originalist method of interpretation that now asks justices and judges to act as Ivy League historians. In the area of new law, we have the adoption of the major questions doctrine, all right, which seems to me has been defined as any question, and every question is a major question for the United States Supreme Court, and the near death of the Chevron doctrine, which in turn will make the courts the absolute overseer of administrative agencies. First Amendment speech and religion and the death of public accommodations exceptions. That is, can you discriminate on the basis of speech and religion in the public sphere? It seems to me the court is saying, yeah, you can, at least against gender issues, or LGBTQ plus, I think is how we pronounce it. The death of affirmative action, except in military academies. And I'm hoping that when we get possibly to Unit 3, one of these gentlemen can explain to me that exception, that affirmative action violates the Constitution, except in military academies. So those are some of the trends, changes since we last talked in April. Tonight, we are going to begin our season with a discussion from Unit 1 on the influence and importance of the Protestant Reformation on American political thought and governance. The specific question reads as such: how did the Protestant Reformation contribute to developing political thought and governance in colonial America? What were the Protestant Reformation's key theological and philosophical concepts, and how did they challenge traditional notions of individual agency and religious freedom? And in what ways did the principles of the Protestant Reformation shape the foundations of religious tolerance, personal liberty, and social contract in early American society? So let's turn to our historian and expert from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Professor Moore. Tim, I'm curious, you also have, I think, a well-developed understanding theologically here. What would you identify as the major or key theological and philosophical concepts of the Protestant Reformation that helped shape European and colonial societies in the 17th and 18th century?
Well, I'm actually quite pleased that you're asking about more than just the political shape of colonial America, because I think you inserted the word society in general, and I think to me that's really important. So I'm glad you asked it that way. As I thought about this a little bit, I think there's maybe four or so things that are important. I think first of all, a lot of the British colonials are coming with an anti-hierarchical ethos. I mean, the whole Reformation itself is a challenge to authority. And that ripples through Europe for 100 years, and Europe is has a tremendous struggle with that the rejection of in some ways Aquinas's theory of society, the great chain of being, and the unity of society, and so they're anti-hierarchical. And then you add the fact that they're British, and then there's another set of anti-hierarchialism that's created when Henry VIII creates a different church for a little less than noble reasons. So I would say that they're anti-hierarchical. And I think that's important as the American colonial world develops. But also I think it ripples through American society in general, and we go through ebb and flows of that. I think there's another thing that, and I think to root that in a theological, I would say that that's kind of the Luther's priesthood of the believer. He had this this view that Christians didn't need a mediary between them and God, and so therefore the priest was not essential. And that's a very leveling principle. And so that anti-hierarchalism, I mean, and the Peasants' War shook him up. How the tremendous backlash that a lot of the German peasants had towards authority, and he really kind of recoiled at that and had to rethink some of the fringe movements within the Reformation. But at root, it's these British colonials are doubly anti-hierarchical. Another thing they do, and I was actually making a couple of presentations this summer, and the groups asked me to kind of delve into really very early colonial documents. And what I noticed is that sometimes they're not even off the boat, but very, very soon, once they arrive, they have these self-identification documents. I mean, the most famous one is the Mayflower Compact. But there's dozens and dozens and dozens of these documents where these people self-identify as a group of people, as Christians. They also, in these documents, also identify as English. So I think that's fascinating. From the very beginning in colonial history, there's two self-identification statements in all of these, and I find that to be interesting, because we know what's coming down the pike here in American history, that there's always going to be this local identity, national identity thing at play. So they're very self-identifying people, and I think that's rooted in another reformational theological concept called covenantalism. Within the Reformed version of the Reformation, there's a tremendous emphasis on covenanting together. It's kind of an old word, but I mean, the closest we would have to is like a really, really serious contract. That's what a covenant is. And many people would still maintain that marriages are covenants, that they're very serious commitments. They're not just these contractual, transactional relationships. So I think the covenantalism forces this very rigorous self-identification of the British colonials. And I think another thing that I think they bring over is that they were wrestling with the 100-year problem of there's two kingdoms. I mean, Augustine did this very, very early in post Rome. Oh no, during Rome. He says there's a kingdom of God, kingdom of man. Now, he kind of drew a hard line between the kingdom of God, kingdom of man, and never the twain shall meet. Well, in the Reformation, all kinds of flavors of Christianity were wrestling with, do those kingdoms stay separated, or do they intersect? I mean, is there any Venn diagram, I guess, that would be a way to say that. And so I think a lot of the British colonials, when they come over with that Reformation ethos, they're wrestling with, and I think some historians have inaccurately called New England theocracy, because in technicality, it's not. There's two kingdoms in play. It's not Geneva, where there's more of a theocratic principle in play, but in the English tradition, there's not that. There's a broader Venn diagram between the two kingdoms. So I think all the British colonials are wrestling with the kingdoms. And sometimes they don't wrestle very well with it. And sometimes they want to separate them, like, Rhode Island wants to separate them very clearly. Massachusetts, quasi. Connecticut, I think there's a quasi separation as well. So I think they bring that over too. They also bring over with an idea of religious liberty, and there's an evolution pattern to that. They come over with religious liberty for me and those who believe like me. And then it kind of evolves to, well, maybe we should have religious liberty for other Christians that aren't just us. So there's, I guess I call it liberty for me, liberty for others that are kind of similar to me. And then by the time we get to some folks in the founding period, there's conscience, liberty of conscience, where there's no religious content to that per se. So I'd say there's an evolution of the religious liberty principle in American history. And again, I would say that's them working out these two kingdoms dilemma that I think Augustine sets up many, many centuries prior. So that's a long-winded answer, but
well, can I ask real quickly, Professor Moore, when you say anti-hierarchical, could we also link that to decentralization?
Absolutely.
Is there a decentralization principle involved here in the
absolutely.
And so and we see that transition to the political sphere clearly,
absolutely,
with the Enlightenment and things like that. So,
yep.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Let me just, for the students, just to clarify, maybe put it in a context. Just so, Tim, I'm really glad you got the word covenant in there, because I think that word is hugely important. And for students to understand, some of you may be aware that you might have homeowner covenants. You might live in a neighborhood where you're not allowed to put up a fence, or you're not allowed to park a motorhome outside in your driveway, or there are all kinds of rules that you enter into in certain neighborhoods and certain covenants that you have to follow those. And it's really not different, than what Tim was talking about, other in the fact that it was a more faith-based. Now you might live in a neighborhood where you're not allowed to put in a swimming pool or something like that, because you've agreed to live under these rules of these homeowners covenants. So just a little explainer there.
So it would seem to me, Professor Kavanaugh, and I hope this makes sense, I've come to believe that we wouldn't have the American colonial experience, development and such, without the Protestant Reformation. All right, that the two go hand in hand, both not only politically but culturally, how the colonies themselves develop. Are we agreed on that? Would you agree with me on that, or do you have a different take?
Well, it's interesting. I was on the path of agreement. It's like, well, yeah, that makes sense. But then I thought, well, wait a minute. Not to be contrarian, though, that is my nature. The Spanish were here before the British. The French were here. And I know, obviously, we could talk about John Calvin, and he was French, but, he's writing this stuff more in as I understand it, in Switzerland, where he was. And, Tim can clean that up for me, or David, you can clean that up. But I don't know that. I think the Reformation plays a role, but I think there's the economics of European nations competing for colonies, and that competition may have happened regardless of the Reformation. I think I would say the Reformation's bigger influence was on leading to the Renaissance, and the science that's going to come out of the Renaissance is going to allow for greater navigation for people like Prince Henry out of Portugal. The creation of the caravel, which is a shallow hull ship, or the sextant, which is going to lead to this age of exploration. And I would think that for many European kingdoms is financially motivated.
I don't disagree, but I think that as equal to the economic is the religious. That the Reformation obviously opens up, all right, hundreds of years of conflict and confrontation over souls.
Well,
all right, Catholics versus Protestants. And my argument is Protestant exploration. all right, you know,
Well, there's Catholic exploration too.
right,
Ask
but
the
Protestant, I mean, and Catholic comes first. All right, is what I'm going to argue, is that the Catholic Church is somewhat ahead of the Protestant Church.
Oh,
And the
yes.
other thing I hope that students consider, and teachers, is to compare, as you said, Chris. Yeah, the Spanish are here and they're Catholic. Is to compare Spanish Catholicism and its colonial development versus English Protestant and Dutch English and Dutch Protestant and their colonial development.
Well, and I'm going to go in. I'll throw in the French Huguenots as well. There are I don't say a plethora, but really kind of three, whether it be three European nations with bringing these religions with them. And I think Tim's point was well made about the Venn diagram, because we are talking about sects of Christianity. I mean, we are talking about different sects of Christianity, whether you're talking Protestant or Catholicism, or the different offshoots, even Quakers, right? We're going to fall within that branch of Christianity. But I think also too, what played a larger role too, David, is, well, one, I like to go back to my boy Niccolo Machiavelli and the development of city-states after the Treaty of Westphalia. So I think the Treaty of Westphalia is after the wars in Europe, which were obviously very bloody, about control between Protestant and Catholic. And we see that going on. The 30 Years' War, I think, is, and David, you know this, you taught this for years, probably one of the bloodiest wars ever. It's the 30 Years' War in Europe. And you have the Treaty of Westphalia, which leads to the creation of these city-states, Machiavelli writing The Prince for the Medici family. I think that also plays a role. So is the Reformation with the colonies, the British North American colonies, because obviously we have the islands as well, we have the Caribbean islands as well, would they have happened just based on the Reformation? I don't know, but I think you just can't, contextually as a historian, I think there's many other aspects to take in, as Tim's chomping at the bit here.
Yeah, I think I think timing really matters here, because if you back up and you go to guys like Raleigh and the Hakluyt brothers, they were pushing for English colonization long before this religious dissenters were interested in bailing out of England. So, I mean, you read some of the Hakluyt essays, and there's a fig leaf of religion in there in the rationalization. They are all over the economic exploration.
Tim, could you want to enlighten me on this, because who these people are? I know
Haklut, Hakluyt, elder and younger. They both were really pushing Elizabeth, who was kind of ambivalent about, I mean, they're still interested in the Northwest Passage, finding, Asia and all that kind of stuff. And that's all economic driven. And, they're trying to remind her that there's money to be made. And so they're pushing for funding to settle America. This is in the late 1500s. So this is well before the religious ethos kicks in, when the English Civil War started, and now those are religious battles. So I think timing, as with anything in history, matters. My point is, I'm not disagreeing, David. I'm just saying timing matters, and there was an economic exploration advocated pretty vigorously before the Puritan exodus.
And I don't deny that. To me, they're kind of co-equal, but I guess I'm a little bit more focused on once they arrive, the development. And wouldn't you agree that if we look at governance and political culture of the English Protestant colonies versus the Spanish Catholic colonies,
sure,
there's those are two very different paths.
Right.
In development. And if you did not have the Reformation, all right, let's eliminate that, and everybody's either a Catholic or Orthodox, and you have of course Judaism to a small degree there in Europe. Are we going to see? I mean, I don't know. Are we going to see as divergent of colonial development in both the culture of the colonies and the political governance of the colonies? Are we going to see that divergence to the same degree as if you did not have?
Yeah.
Well, I think of like the Spanish encomienda system, that is set up and for financial gain, and the pacification of the original people that lived here by the Spanish, and then you get pushback, and then the Spanish soften their stance, and then fast forward to the French in what was then French Canada, or the Northwest, or the northern parts of. You think of how the Jesuits interacted with Native Americans, also Christians, obviously, and then how the British colonists, Protestants, will interact with the Native Americans. You have these, the three different layers of things, and I'm saying this in a long-winded way, David, of kind of agreeing with you in terms of the development there, because I think those are good for students. Those are, and I don't know how that may relate to the actual question for students, but again, thinking like a historian, like Professor Moore, contextualization is really, really important. And so when you think about the British North American colonies as they start to develop, a lot, as Tim had already mentioned, for religious liberty, for me, not for you, but for me, those systems are going to play out differently than, say, the French system to the north, or to the Spanish system in the south and southwest.
So, Professor Williams, I think we're all well aware as we move into the 20th century. All right.
I just had one more thought that really actually supports your view, David. It's interesting that in the intolerable acts, one of them was the Quebec Act. And it was the most irksome of the four intolerable acts. And a lot of the newspapers and sermons of the day saw that. I mean, you would have thought that the Reformation was last week. This Quebec Act was such an affront to Protestant Americans. They saw this was, the evil hand of the Pope. It extended, Quebec all the way down to the Ohio River. And so a lot of the rhetoric saw the Quebec Act and potentially the whole revolution as a continuation of Reformation issues. And also all through the founding, there's always this strand of, I wrote this down this morning when I saw this again, Jesuitical influence. And so there's a lot of folks that are still continuing to rehash the Reformation issues in the founding period. So, I mean, that goes to your point, I think.
David, I know you want to ask me a question, but can I just add on to this really quick? Because it's obvious. And it's more something for the students to think about, because I am not at all an expert in this, but this comparative discussion, I guess I wasn't expecting it to take this turn, which has been great.
My bad.
No, I love it. And a couple of things come to mind, just the students to think about, to maybe dive in to these differences we're kind of pointing out between Spanish colonialism, French colonialism, British colonialism. The role of church, when I think of, there are remnants of Spanish colonialism all over California, and they show up in the form of missions that were territorial and that came with forts. And the Protestants are going to have a strong missionary experiences as well, but it takes on it seems to take on a different feature. So I'd have the students think about that. And then the other thing that came to mind is, and I'm supporting your claim, David, but I do think that the Reformation, Industrial Revolution, Enlightenment, they're kind of like, they all kind of come together in a particular way that I think has a particular influence on the colonies, and as well as some other sort of immigrant countries. But what's interesting when I think about South Africa, what South African historians teach is that many of the first Dutch to go to South Africa in the 1650s, about the same time that it was happening here in the United States, they were looking for religious liberty as well, right? But the Enlightenment ideas and the industrialization practices did not go to South Africa in the same way. So when the British show up in South Africa in the 1800s, the Afrikaners are very proud to call themselves doppers, which is an Afrikaans word that means to literally put the candle out. like what they learned about the Enlightenment. They're like, we don't want anything to do with the Enlightenment down here. And it just strikes me that that's an interesting comparative analysis of what happens in places where these three big changes in society and economics don't happen in the same way as they're going to happen in the colonies. So I don't know how to parse out what's the cause and what's kind of coming together, but I think they're all kind of related.
Well, kind of building on that and what Tim had mentioned, this notion of religious liberty. I think we would agree that when we get to the late 19th and early 20th century, the United States the 19th and 20th century, the United States is a fairly strong anti-Catholic society, not just socially, but politically. All right. And I see the roots of that in the Reformation and how that Reformation, through the colonial experience develops. Are you with me on that there, Professor Williams? Would you trace the anti-Catholicism of American history to the Reformation's influence on American governance and political thought?
Well, sure. I mean, and I know Tim and Chris and you can add to these examples, but in the original charters in the 1640s and 50s for most colonies, there were laws explicitly prohibiting the practice of Catholicism. So it definitely shows up in the laws early on in the colonies. And I do think there's a little thing, like we've talked on previous seasons about Wilkinson's book on caste and this idea of never wanting to be like at the bottom of the caste. You always want to have someone that you can have your liberty, but you can persecute as well. And it seems to me that to the extent that the English people coming over were looking for religious liberty, they were looking to practice different forms of Protestantism that didn't align with the Anglican Church, is my understanding, Tim.
Yep. At
the same time they're doing that, they definitely don't want Catholics to practice, right? And I think it feeds into him. I thought the way you set us up here was really great. I mean, if you're anti-hierarchical, to have a pope in charge of the church and a belief that you have to do what the pope says, I think it's natural that folks are going to be very resistant to that. I mean, so I was struck by a couple of things in looking at this history. I was struck by the laws that were in place that were anti-Catholic. I learned about Pope Night, which was celebrated every November 5th up until after the Revolution in the United States, where people would come out and basically make fun of Catholic rituals and symbols. That lasted into the 1780s. And at the same time, at our first national census, Catholics only made up like 1.6% of the population, we think. So it wasn't like there was a large group of Catholics that were threatening anyone under a democratic sort of majority system. So I do think there's something to do with the Reformation itself, but also for these English people to be on the other end of it, right? To have the power to then set up society and politics in a way where they're not going to be discriminated against and to discriminate against others.
I mean, the Quakers were infinitely more hated than the Catholics, and that's probably there's more Quakers than there were Catholics, and so that there were much too anti-hierarchical for everybody. I mean, there's always a sweet spot. Do you want a little bit of hierarchy or none whatsoever? Well, the Quakers were so anti-hierarchical. They didn't have preachers. You sat around and waited for somebody to get the Spirit to speak. So that, I mean, they are a scary group of people within that Protestant tradition. So
and again, I think it's a stretch here in some ways to reference the English as Protestants. There, Tim, is that the transition under Henry is okay, we now have the Church of England and I'm the head of it, but there's no principles, there's no theological change whatsoever. Elizabeth comes along and they're going to dabble a little bit.
My Orthodox friends might, my Episcopalian friends will probably go with spastic on that one, but
it's not under Henry, and that it's much later. Elizabeth and others decide, hey, it'd probably be a good idea if we actually attach some principles, to the Church of England here and Anglicanism and things like that. But
Fair enough.
the
Fair enough.
hierarchical element of Protestantism in the United States, to me, emanates from this Church of England tradition, which is very much a mirror image of Catholicism in many ways. But the other branches of the Reformation, as you say, the Calvinists, the Quakers, the Lutherans and stuff, bring over much different traditions there, kind of thing. So, Chris, you look like you're in thought, or
I was got to be really careful because I was going to say something about Henry VIII and the creation of the Church of England.
Get
but,
careful.
Yeah, for the students that have not had a world history course, hopefully you've had one. You understand that the Pope would not grant him an annulment from his wife because she could not bear him a male heir to the throne, and so he just breaks with the church on his own to create the Anglican Church, so he can annul his wedding. And he doesn't have much luck with wives, or I should say, his wives don't have much luck.
Well, for the students out there, if you want a quick kind of historical hack with this, just look up the
hack. Did you say
Yeah,
hack?
over a hack. I'm speaking. I'm talking like the kids these days. The musical Six. Check out that soundtrack. Each former wife of Henry VIII gets a hip hop rap song to explain what happened to them. It's a good way to learn history.
And if you want to have a lot of fun, look at all their paintings, because I think Henry had a type.
Yeah, that's probably true there. Let's circle back here to the colonial period.
Hey, there we go.
Hey,
the bus driver's back on the bus.
So Professor Moore, we've kind of referenced and touched on this, but if we could dig a little bit deeper, to what extent do you see the Reformation's impact on American colonial development political? What are the political elements, and what are the more social cultural elements of the Reformation on colonial development?
Well, they're congregationalism. That means we get to choose our own pastors and we make decisions within our own church. There's not a hierarchy or bishops or archbishops to dictate downwards. So this congregationalism, I think, has a heavy influence on localist democracy. Most notably, everybody talks about the New England town meeting. Well, that's a very logical political extension of congregationalism within how they ran their churches. I think the social fabric too is interesting because there's this social theory called the commonweal theory, and what it is, it's very opposed to the Aquinian way of thinking about a hierarchy of being, a hierarchy of society. The commonweal theory is that the butcher and the blacksmith and the pastor and the carpenter, they all have a very fundamentally important part of society. And society should never make distinctions that, I don't know, maybe political science professors are more important than auto mechanics. So the commonweal theory of society, I think, is an outgrowth of this notion of this leveling of society, the equality of people. And I think Massachusetts maybe still calls himself a commonwealth. I know Virginia does. But it's what it is, it's a theory of how society should interact with each other. And it's anti-hierarchical. I think it also, well, I'm going to get into the Weber thesis. I mean, Max Weber wrote a fundamentally important, absolutely great analysis of the impact of Calvinists on capitalism. And he makes the argument that the Calvinists were just perfect to really create this free market capitalism. And he kind of does a little Freudian analysis of them, since they're so afraid of their status before God, that the only indicators they have that they're saved is these economic indicators. So my wealth is an indicator of my salvation. Now, in my estimation, that's a tremendous misreading of first of all Calvinists in general, and second of all English Calvinist, because I think he got a little too psycho-history there with analyzing the culture that frankly Calvinists on the continent, as well as in England, are not capitalists. I mean, the Calvinists come over here and set up all kinds of regulatory pricing. They have bread. They have published prices for bread. I mean, up and through the American Revolution, there's still controls in most colonies and states about the pricing of certain basic fundamental goods. And so I don't know. So I understand it's a very attractive thing to say, you know, this Calvinism and their rigorous individualism led them to this commitment to Calvinism. But I have some questions about that because I think he misread it. And I think the theology of Calvinists is not particularly comfortable with, and in some ways it's actually antithetical to certainly untethered capitalism. But there is an argument to be made that there is an influence on the growth of capital, the economic piece that you referenced in your question.
Go ahead, Chris.
I'm sorry, Dave, let me jump in. Tim, you're listening to talk about the commonweal. That makes me think of Martin Luther. I mean, when he leaves the priesthood, he gets married, right?
Yeah.
Has children, like 6 kids or something like that. And he talks about chores, you know, being just as important as, you know, maybe, you know, your religious studies.
Sure.
So that leveling effect of
Absolutely.
just that working thing. And help me out here because,
well, he called it your vocational calling.
Yeah,
it's as sacred as the priest or himself, frankly. So
which makes sense considering his 95 theses and where, I mean, because I don't think when he nails his theses on the church door in Wittenberg, Germany, that he's thinking about overthrowing the church.
No, heavens no.
He's actually wanting to try and save the church, and I think through that process you end up with the Reformation to reform. If students think about just the word itself, to reform, not to rebel. And help me out here with Calvinism, because predestination is determined. Is it not?
Yeah, I mean, that's where I think Weber is totally wrong. I mean, I don't think he understands that concept of Calvinism. Calvinists are pretty secure in their standing before God, even though we all admit that we're sacks of crap at times. So I think it's this psychologizing of insecurity is in my estimation, a tremendous misreading by Weber of the Calvinists.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that clarification.
Yeah. Thanks for asking.
Well, Chris, maybe you can help with something because, you know,
I'm probably just going to ask Tim.
Well, the text emphasizes this notion of individualism as an outgrowth of the Protestant Reformation. Yet Tim and you are talking about this commonweal, this commonality, this almost classical Republican notion here. So how do you or can you explain what is meant by this focus on individualism within the Reformation and how that squares with, I think, what we've been talking about here about more of a collective sense? That's
a great question, I think. And I think it honestly, to look deeper, to go back to the commonweal and, you know, the idea about vocation, I think it creates a much, I almost said healthier society. I don't know if it creates a healthier society, but you create a society where status, you know, I may be a blacksmith, but my status is just as important as this guy down the road that may be a preacher, or, you know, he may be a religious leader. He may have more money than me. So my position in society is just as important, as opposed to perhaps people with money or people with greater land or estate or title. And so I think you start to see that leveling. I mean, we could even talk about the levelers if we want to go back to Parliament. Yeah. I think that's part of it.
Well, do you see? I understand theologically this notion of individualism and an individual relationship with God, salvation comes through that relationship with God, not through the church as an organized institution kind of thing. Do you really believe that translates to social cultural?
Yeah, I do. I think Tim talked about this. I think especially in the colonies, because when these and I think it's important for the students, because I wanted to press Tim on this for a second. What happens in New England versus what happens maybe in the traditional middle colonies, what happens more in the southern colonies. As you get into your early American history, I think you're going to see different developments within those colonial structures, which are definitely related to their economic structures. Excuse me. But I think what you start to see, because when the white people started showing up, they're creating these little enclaves, and they're kind of on their own. And if you go back to the idea of Calvinism or Lutheranism, and the idea that as Tim alluded earlier, we're cutting out the middleman, right? So we're just as important, and we don't have to take orders from and David, you said this, from some central authority. We're setting it up here within our little settlement. And so there's, kind of like when you end up with a colonial capital, you're not the boss of me.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So on that larger imperial relation, I understand that, but within the colonies themselves, classism does not die. Status does not die.
No.
Right. This individualism as a theological idea of the equality, in the eyes of God. Okay, but that does not translate whether New England or middle colonies or southern colonies. There's still this social status, power within governance. All right, that exists up to and after the Revolution. Don't you agree?
My fellow fops here, Mike is jumping, and then
yeah, I know. Okay, Mike, yes, you have.
Go ahead, Mike.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Tim, and then I'll come in.
Your original question is fascinating to me, and I didn't think about it much until I was listening. Well, that's a terrible thing to say. Anyway, I wonder, try this out. I wonder if the individualism piece that you're asking about, David, is really an enlightenment question. Because I don't think the religious commitments and how they work out socially and economically, I don't know that those are enlightenment ideas. I mean, you yourself said they're setting up these little communities. And if there is a religious underlayment to all of that, these are all pre-modern. So the individualism is there in a spiritual sense. The collectivism is there in a social sense. So I don't know that the individual, and I do think the We the People texts wants to make this analogy that individualism comes from the Reformation. I don't believe it does, but it seems to be the way the text is written. I see individualism as an enlightenment string pattern, not a religious pattern. So I think there's a little fast and loose with how individualism is explained in the text, if that makes sense. I mean, religion is pre-modern, so I don't know that there's a ton of commitment to individualism, certainly the way we would configure it today.
Mike?
Well, I'm gonna join the bandwagon and say that this is a really, really good question, David. And I think, for the students, I think we live in a world where the narrative is, if you ask people what it means to be American, right after freedom or liberty is going to come this idea of individualism, right? And we've told ourselves that story so much that we don't really understand that for much, we are a very individualistic society right now, but I think it's kind of an outlier period of where we've been most of our history. So I think the way I'm reading this conversation is like, Tim, you kind of pointed out earlier, the Quakers were too small d democratic, right? Even for the Englishmen. So we have to remember that during this time, right, individual autonomy within theology, within the Catholic Church, wasn't really there. So all these kind of pressures against that are trying to make more space. But Tim's 4 things he brought up, the anti-hierarchalism, right, goes along with this idea of identity being English, with covenantalism, which is a promise. not to just you and your God, but to you and your community. Nowhere did Tim mention that this was anti-communal. So I think there's a sweet spot where you can see that there is individualism, there maybe is more capitalism, but it's not this narrative that we tell ourselves today. I mean, we don't remind students that Adam Smith thought that there was plenty of room to regulate the economy.
Yeah.
I don't think we tell the students enough about what Tim and Chris, your examples of at the time of the revolution, that there were regulations on how much bread cost, right? And I think
Let me check. And if Tim, well, no, I'm going to come back to you, Mike. But Tim and Chris, if you could also send that material to members of the Supreme Court, I think that'd be helpful as we talk about the administrative regulatory state.
Well, they have our books. I don't know whether they're reading them, but they got our stuff.
So I'm
Well,
sorry,
I wanna-
Mike. I just
no, that's good.
I want to jump back, David, to what you're saying. I'm not disagreeing about the classism, because if you think about it, for the students, who's coming here, right? If we're talking about the early British colonial movement in North America, who's coming here? Well, your people are coming for their own religious freedom, as we have alluded to a couple of times, and they're if you're doing okay on the continent, you're not coming across on a ship. You're staying there. So when you come here, you push people off the land that live here. You chop down some trees. You build yourself a home. You farm or fish or whatever you're going to do. You just lifted yourself up in society. You've gone from being down here in society. Now you're a property owner. And so absolutely, David, you're right about that classism, so to speak, because now you have a vested interest in how society is going to run in your community, and you have more say than you might have had back on the continent. So that absolutely plays a role.
Well,
But you're not gonna survive unless you work together. And that's why I fast forward to 1890 in the Turner thesis, and he talks about what separates us, from our European ancestors was our struggle on the frontiers, and he marks those frontier lines in his thesis. But he talks about that very concept that Michael mentioned, which was individualism. Thank you, Herbert Hoover, right? Rugged individualism. But people don't survive. I mean, people go in wagon trains for a reason.
Yeah.
Because it's safer. People have to work together to survive when you're trying to carve a niche out of the wilderness.
I mean, that's where there's a lot of people that think Turner's nuts. That to Mike's point, the communal effort for most of our history, the West wasn't conquered individuals. It was a communal effort, and John Wesley Powell noted that there needed to be control of the rivers.
Right, and I guess that's my struggle here. Is to me, there's this linkage of the Protestant Reformation as a beginning point to some degree of what will become American exceptionalism, buying into some of what I consider the mythology of Protestantism, this notion of individualism. Yeah, and theologically, I see it there, and maybe there's this transition from a theologic to political through the Enlightenment, Tim. Maybe that's what the text is. I don't know if that's what's trying to do there, but I'm struggling with this whole idea of this individual principle, all right, that both the text and even this question, and Mike, I'll ask you to comment first. I mean, the question implies that the Reformation lays a foundation for personal liberty, limited government, and again, I'll take a little bit of issue with Tim, religious tolerance. I don't see any religious tolerance in American colonial experience. All right, at what, 12 of the 13 colonies, have certain religious mandates, taxes that you must pay, and I don't see personal liberty as far as as I understand it, being a high value in colonial America here. So I guess I'm struggling with what the question seems to try to make this connective tissue between the Reformation and these values or principles, and I'm having a hard time seeing it. Are you with me, Mike?
I am. I mean, I think the discussion we're having, I think students should really think about that connection, because I think we take it as for granted. I think there's no way. I know I don't want to bring in too much presentism, but these types of arguments, it's part of the cultural wars that are going on right now, in terms of rooting the American experience back to a certain type of religious identity
Right.
or cultural identity. And I think we're pointing out that there's a lot more nuance to the historical story than that. I would, though, I mean, we started off, and again, I'd have the students think about this. We started off this discussion, and all of us were kind of nodding our heads in agreement how Spanish colonialism, French colonialism is different from, right? And Samuel Huntington, in one of his famous works on understanding American political culture, kind of makes that same point. He says if America was colonized and successfully colonized by Spanish, we wouldn't have all these values, right? So we've already kind of like nodded in agreement to that, but I would ask students, look at survey opinions now. Spanish cultures value individualism as much as Americans do. They practice democracy as much or maybe better than Americans do right now. So I think there is, I don't know, I think we have to be careful about being too, we call it political science, we call it path dependent, where you kind of like point out some historical moment, like we take for granted the history. Tim and Chris and Dave tell us the history. We're like, okay, we're going to use this now and talk about path dependency, but we don't know much. We use it as a marker.
Man.
Yeah, I know.
Man, the political science is fighting back. All right.
I thought he just kind of pulled back the curtain a little bit there.
I think
A little bit. Yeah, I'll teach you the secret handshake after the next one.
Chris or Tim, thoughts?
I tend to, you know, I'm going to go with path dependency. That sounds like I think that was supporting what you're arguing for, David. And I would agree with that. I think we tend to, I think the Protestantism, the Reformation, that the spirit of that, at least, I think is an excuse or a justification for that concept of American exceptionalism. You know, fast forward to President Reagan, the city on the hill kind of thing, and that has actually permeated throughout our society. Sometimes it's stronger and sometimes it's less. We see that, as Michael said, creeping up in the culture wars now. But holy smokes, I was listening to Michael earlier and I was thinking about a great book. I don't have it to hold up. It's called Fire in the Heartland. It's about the rebirth of the Klan in Indiana, my home state, in the 1920s. And oh my goodness, you know, the anti-Catholicism was rampant. You know, that rebirth of the Klan, and we, you know, it's because we want to hold ourselves up again as that shining city on the hill. So I think that's directly related, David, to your point that this concept of American exceptionalism, and you know, back to your point about liberty, and it's just, I don't want to say it's a sham, but.
Yeah. Well, I think I think, you know, kids, and we talk about this every season. We suggest to the kids that they very, very critically sometimes look at these questions, because sometimes these questions make assumptions that I don't know that are necessarily agreed upon, you know, by a lot of scholars or you know, at least by the four of us, if we agree upon.
There's scholars, and then there's the four of us.
Four of us, right?
Yeah, I hope. Yeah, I want to delineate there, but you know, it's like, again, Tim, you did talk about religious tolerance, and I don't associate that with the Reformation, because we obviously have the Catholic Protestant conflicts that will wage for very long. But when it comes to the North American colonies, it's Protestant versus Protestant. There's still major conflict, and it has nothing to do with the Catholic Protestant divide. It's about the denominational explosion of so-called Protestantism.
Right. And well, but I'd also challenge you to maybe consider that your definition of tolerance doesn't fit that time.
Explain.
Well, I mean, you know, if I'm a Catholic in an overwhelmingly Protestant town, I could still be a wealthy person and have a lot of influence. I just can't run for public office. Well, I might not care. And I might, and there's all kinds of instances where minority religions were in towns where there was a majority religion, and they felt no particular problem about that, nor did they aspire to political office. So and they would actually use the phrasings of tolerance here in America. So I think I think the word tolerance I think has gone through some change, and our modern understanding of it may not fit colonial America.
Well, and I would throw out George Washington. He's written about toleration, right? Some of Washington's writings about toleration in terms of, he didn't like that word because it implies there's a hierarchy and there are people up above that will tolerate the people below.
Yeah.
And I think that but I would agree with you, David, to a degree. And we don't really start to see a pushback until we get perhaps Jefferson, Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, Madison, Memorial and Remonstrances. So we finally, with some of these early folks, maybe Ethan Allen.
Oh, golly, yeah. Oh, man.
I mean, so there are some people on this side of the Atlantic who will truly talk about liberty, not toleration, liberty for religious liberty. But that takes a while, I think.
Yeah.
And I want to share this nugget for the students. Holy cow! You want to talk about divide between Protestant and Catholic? Go to Belfast in Northern Ireland. There's still certain neighborhoods where they're burning pictures of the Pope to this day. So that divide is still exists in the world, not just is prevalent in the United States now.
Can I ask one quick question on this? That was super interesting about just what tolerance means, because I was reading and getting ready for this episode that Maryland was one of the few states that in the 1640s passed a Tolerance Act.
Yeah.
I think it was there for like 7 years. I may have the years wrong. And then they repealed it. But then after the revolution, or maybe I think after the revolution, I think most states adopted Tolerance Acts.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering then, the way we're talking about it, for the students to think about this, it's tolerance doesn't mean like, maybe today we think about tolerance as like in our private and public lives, like that your heart should be warm towards people.
Yeah.
And maybe the way they're thinking about it 250 years ago is just that you can or cannot run for office.
It wasn't affirmational.
Right, you can or cannot own property.
And I don't care if you're a Baptist, you're still going to pay taxes to support the Anglican.
Right.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
Well, the revolution really challenged a lot of some of these rigorous Protestants. Hey, there were Catholics that fought on our side on this.
Right.
I mean,
in France came to the rescue.
Yeah.
And I hate to say it, Tim, but there were also some Jews too.
Oh,
yeah. Kind of thing, which some of, I'll save my comments.
You just checked all the diversity boxes there, David.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, time is always our enemy. So let's go to our what has now become our traditional close, and that is recommendations you would make to students and teachers as they explore and consider this question. So Professor Kavanaugh.
Oh, great. Good.
Yeah. Caught you off guard.
No, I like that. I appreciate that, because I'm going to go with what David had just said. I think it's good, but I think it's more difficult to challenge the very premise of the question. Don't have to accept the parameters of the question. But to do that, to challenge that, you better to have your ducks in a row.
Yep.
But I would encourage you with this question. And also, we've talked about at least I've talked about contextualization. There's a lot going on throughout the world, throughout North America. So think about the context of things and how that relates. And that's really that historical skill in thinking about contextualization. But and this is the idea of accepting the parameters of the question. That's true for all the questions that you're going to be dealing with. So I would encourage you with that. And obviously, when you're talking about religion and faith, you still have to be very respectful. I think, that's a given. So.
Professor Williams.
Yeah, that's good advice. We've already kind of touched on this. Students, you should be aware of the landmines in terms of accepting the assumptions of this question. So I don't think we don't expect you to be, no one's going to expect you to be like historical experts of this period. But I think looking at some of these primary documents, looking at some of the covenant documents, looking at some of the laws that were passed, and trying to square that with sort of the spirit of this question. I think if you have some of those specific examples that either, sort of whichever way that helps you argue, I think those examples would be really good for you to have at the ready as you're either in your statement or as you're talking about it.
Professor Moore.
Well, that's a great lead in because there's two great books on this topic, both by Don Lutz, Lutz. One is a series of chapters, historical narratives on the religious life in colonial America. And the other book is edited by Lutz. And what Don has done is he's put together, several hundred early documents in colonial American history that shows a lot of these principles that are floating around in there. These reformational ideas that show up here in this world. So that book is called maybe The Documentary History of English blah 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 religion. Colonials is in there. I have him at the office. I don't have him here. But we'll put links and the actual title of the book in the resource section. But those two books are, I would suggest, for teachers to get a hold of and you discuss those books.
Well, I don't have anything to add to what our three scholars have recommended, students and teachers. Hopefully this gives you a little bit more insight and maybe a different way to look at the questions. So in our next episode, you can let your Unit 6 compadres know that we'll be talking about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And first and foremost, trying to figure out, does it still exist? Until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye. Bye, bonds.